I had a burning question in my head ever since that point in time, which was why me? Why did they do this? What motivated these men to attack someone like me? Did they actually hate me? Is the term hate actually useful?
Hi everyone, my name is Peggy Lohr, and it is my pleasure to fill in today for Doug Barr, President of the St. Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. I would like to welcome you all to the forum's program titled The Science of Hate, which is the title of the book of our featured speaker today. The Forum, as many of you know, is an educational nonprofit with a mission to entertain, to inform, and to inspire by presenting a broad mix of humanities-based programming. Before we get started, let me ask you if you believe you're mindful of your own prejudices. Most of us are loath to admit that we harbor any prejudices, but the fact is, according to our guest, Dr. Williams, nearly everyone is guilty of prejudice. Matthew Williams is a professor of criminology in the School of Social Sciences at the prestigious Cardiff University in Wales. He's also the director of the Economic and Social Research Council's Hate Lab project, which has received significant media attention, having been featured in the LA Times, The Observer, The Independent, The Guardian, The Financial Times, The Sun, and The New York Post, to name a few. Dr. Williams is the author of The Science of Hate. It is about how prejudice becomes hate and what we can do to stop it. He's on the editorial boards for the British Journal of Criminology, the Journal of Computer Social Science, and is widely considered one of the world's leading experts on contemporary forms of hate and cybercrime. Dr. Williams is also a member of the British European and American Society of Criminology, and he himself was a victim of a hate crime. We've asked our friend David Fried to join us in conversation today with Dr. Williams. Dave is an instrument-rated pilot, a screenwriter, a novelist, and a former award-winning investigative journalist for the Los Angeles Times, where he shared a Pulitzer Prize for the newspaper's coverage of the Los Angeles riots. And he was an individual finalist for the Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal for Public Service. This is the most prestigious award in American journalism. Dave appears regularly in Smithsonian Magazine, Air and Space Magazine, and The Atlantic. He has also worked extensively within the U.S. intelligence community. He holds a Master of Liberal Arts degree from Harvard and currently teaches creative writing at the Harvard Extension School. This is a conversation we've been looking forward to. So let's jump right in and welcome Dave Fried in conversation with Professor Mark Williams. And Dave will start us off.
Peggy, thank you so much. And Matt, thank you for being with us on the forum today. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you also for this phenomenal book, this enlightening. It was very enlightening reading it. I can't think of a subject that is more topical today than the question of hate. It seems every day that our world and the United States in particular are awash in hate. So hopefully in the next hour or so, we're going to explore that phenomena and maybe find some ways to work our way through it. Your book does two things at once. It explains the latest science on why humans are driven to hate. It draws on psychology, neuroscience, big data research. But it also tells a personal story, as was previously mentioned. You yourself were once the victim of a hate crime, an experience that changed the way the trajectory of your life and also your research. So you explore in the book how prejudice can tip over into violence and how online hate bleeds into the real world, and what can actually be done to reduce it. So again, our goal today is to get behind the science and hear from you about not only what drives hate, but also where you find reason for hope. So with that, I think it would be helpful for us to understand how your own experience with a hate crime shaped the way you researched and wrote this book.
Absolutely. And thank you for asking me to come on. You're right in saying that it all began with a hate crime. It was about 25 years ago. I had just finished my undergraduate degree in sociology in the United Kingdom. And I had essentially gone out to celebrate with friends. We'd gone to London. We spent the day in Regent's Park in the sunshine. We then went for some food and drink, and it turned into more of a sprawling celebration. It was a great occasion. It was a milestone in our lives. But it turned out to be a very different kind of milestone for me. It was definitely a juncture in my life. During that celebration, we went to a bar known for the diversity of its clientele. Let's put it that way. It was a bar known to welcome gay men and women. And during my time there, I stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. And I came out of the bar, lit my cigarette, and stood outside. And then I was approached by a man. That gentleman asked me for a light. I obliged, took out my lighter, and before I could flick the flint, everything went black. I then came 2 seconds later with this distinctive tang of blood in my mouth, and it was definitely, an attack. It felt like I had been, hit around the head. There was that dinning, sort of ringing in my head. And I looked up and saw my attacker above me laughing. And then he was joined by another 2 of his accomplices. And in that moment, it became very apparent that there had been a victim of a hate crime. And that was confirmed when one of them then spat out a homophobic slur. And instead of retaliating in that moment, I kind of stayed down and tried to minimize the violence. I didn't want to accelerate it. I didn't want others coming out behind me of the club and also being attacked. I just kind of felt like a coward, actually, in the moment. But I think at the time I was just thinking, let's just stay and minimize that violence as much as I can. They took their prize and they walked away. But it became apparent to me in that moment that they'd been waiting patiently for me outside that bar, or anybody, essentially, but I was the unlucky one that came out when they were there. And I was a victim of a homophobic hate crime in that moment. And that changed not only my personal life. I felt like I was, I guess, in some ways, stolen of intimacy. I felt like I could no longer display my true self in public. If you put it that way, I kind of monitored my behavior a lot after that. But it also changed my career. I had a burning question in my head ever since that point in time, which was why me? Why did they do this? What motivated these men to wait so patiently outside that place and to attack someone like me? What was it? Essentially them policing their turf? Did they actually hate me? Is the term hate actually useful in this context? And I decided to change my studies from becoming a journalist, which is what I planned to do after my undergrad degree, do a master's in journalism, and instead embark on a degree in criminology, a master's in criminology, to focus my studies on understanding why people form prejudices and then act upon them in violent ways. That then led on to the PhD, and ever since a 25-year career in studying the motivations of essentially hate criminals and understanding why people act upon their prejudices in sometimes violent and, unfortunately, sometimes very lethal ways.
So a journalist is taught to be objective as they go about gathering facts and reporting the news. How did your personal experience with a hate crime affect your capability to be objective as a research scientist?
Sure, that's a really good question. I can't say with utter confidence that it has. I mean, the whole endeavor of sort of scientific inquiry, if you like, of studying crime and its consequences requires an objective standpoint. So I'm a quantitative criminologist. We use sort of numbers, quantitative data to understand human behavior. So we do tend to aim to strip out the personal from our scientific endeavors. And my whole career has been based on that kind of approach. That said, the personal is always tied up with the political. The personal will always be part of my experience in a sense. And it's what's driven me in a sense to actually continue to study something that's so dark. I think it's, from a psychological perspective, it's quite difficult to maintain an interest in this area when it's so harrowing, especially with what's going on in the world right now. And the personal experience has driven me to understand better the subject and to actually come at it from a scientific point of view more than a political standpoint, in a sense. I do have a political standpoint. Obviously, I cannot remove that from my being. That said, I am fully aware of its effects on my ability to understand the concept of hate. So I'm fully aware of, or as well as I possibly can be, of the influence of my experience and the politics that I hold on the subject. And I do try to remove it in certain ways by using scientific methods.
So given what you know now, as opposed to that evening when you were attacked, if you had the opportunity to confront the person or the people who attacked you, what would you say to them?
I would forgive them, because I've come to understand that prejudice is present in everybody. None of us is without prejudice. It's a part of who we are. It's essentially a part of our evolved sort of mechanism, if you like, our biological, physiological, psychological mechanism. Becoming aware of that prejudice is something that we all need to do, I believe. So therefore, we can then understand when it's tipping over potentially into hate and something more violent. So in many ways, I understand the process through which these men had gone through in their socialization through their lives to reach that point where they could act upon their violence. So in some ways, I would, oddly, it may sound slightly odd, but forgive them, but also at the same time, tell them how their act upon me generated a 25-year career and trying to understand hatred. And without that incident, I don't think I would have embarked on this career. I wouldn't have written this book. And I'd like to present them each with a copy of the book and say, well, look, this is, while it's regretful what you did on that day, this is what came out of it. And I think that in some ways that's a beautiful message. It's a beautiful message to tell anyone who's in that frame of mind, who's got that kind of very hateful worldview, that we understand why this can happen in the lab, through psychological experiments, through analysis of big data and online behaviors. We understand why people get to a certain point of frustration and that they need a scapegoat to vent that frustration, and that sometimes can tip into violence. As psychologists and criminologists, we understand the process. So I'm not saying that divests the person of responsibility. I think it's not inevitable that everyone that experiences a set of forces of this nature becomes violent and acts out in a violent way. We do have an ability to prevent that from happening. But with a scientific understanding that I've generated over the last 25 years, and many other scholars have done the same in the field of psychology and criminology and beyond, we understand why it happens, which is a hopeful message, I think. The science is there to not only understand why this happens, but also it allows us to communicate to a broader audience why it's happening, and hopefully, therefore, prevent through education and compassion.
What is the main difference between prejudice and hate? And can you give us an example or two that distinguishes one from the other?
Sure. Well, prejudices aren't necessarily all bad. We form stereotypes of people in groups from early childhood. It's the way that our brains work. Essentially, our brains are very miserly. They take shortcuts all the time. We can't possibly absorb all of the information out there in the world all at once and then make decisions based on the vast amounts of data that are out there. So we have to take shortcuts to understand the social world as it presents itself to us. So we constantly create stereotypes about groups and people, good and bad. So we hear the word stereotype, we usually think, well, that's a bad thing. A stereotype is just an inaccurate representation of a group or a person that's part of a group. But there are also positive stereotypes that exist also. So stereotypes are just there to help us understand the world around us in a very efficient way. But it's when those stereotypes become weaponized and get turned into potential prejudices that we start to see problems emerging. Most of the prejudices that we experience aren't necessarily that significant. They're kind of implicit. We're not aware of them, but they're kind of operating in the background. What the kinds of behaviors they can result in would, say, for example, be push behaviors. We push certain groups away from us that we feel may be at odds with our worldview, or we find mildly threatening in a cultural way. Their worldviews or values we might feel are different from ours, or we find them potentially physically threatening in some way, or economically threatening. We feel, for example, that they outsiders may be coming to our country and making us poorer, making us in some way diluting a culture or whatever it might be. In those circumstances, people with those kinds of prejudices tend to push those groups away. What does that mean? They may not invite them around to the local barbecue. They may cross to the other side of the road if they see a certain person from a group, from what they might consider an out group. They may ask their kids not to play with them in the playground, and so on and so forth. They are exclusion. They exclude the groups, but they're not violent behaviors. It's when prejudice becomes more weaponized and individuals start to pull those groups towards them to harm them. And that's when we see prejudice tipping into hate. So it's an interesting distinction between push and pull behaviors. Pushing people away because we feel that they're at odds with our worldview or our culture, but then pulling them towards us because those prejudices have become so much more extreme that it tips into what we might consider hateful behavior. So when you pull groups towards you, you pull them towards you to do them harm. You pull them towards you to enact violence on them, which is what happened to me. Those three men outside that bar that night pulled me towards them. They were waiting for me to enact harm upon me. And at the extreme end of that spectrum, we therefore then get horrific scenarios like genocides, where there's active behaviors to actually exclude whole populations from societies in the most horrific means possible. And obviously that can include wiping out whole segments of the population. We're seeing that occur right now. So it's that tipping point between prejudice and hate that's the kind of the holy grail for the scientific study of this kind of phenomena. Can we pinpoint what that tipping point is? And in the book, I go through a series of what I call accelerants that might explain to some extent how a prejudice might tip into hate. And an individual has to go through a series of life experiences to actually edge them closer and closer to that kind of pull type behavior where groups are pulled towards you for harmful intentions.
Does by your definition, does hate manifest itself in the ambition of doing physical harm to those people who you hate?
Hate's an interesting word. We use it a lot in, I guess, news reports. We even use it in academia when we write papers, journal articles, and books on the topic. But hate is a clumsy word. It's not very scientific. It's not a very scientific word, if you like, which makes it very hard to define. It's a very emotive word, and I think that entangling those kinds of terms and the emotions associated with those terms with the scientific study of the phenomena is potentially problematic. I use it as the title of my book because people understand broadly what it means. They know what they're getting when they pick up that book and open the pages. It's embedded in common parlance, if you like. But the scientific study of it rarely uses the term hate. If you look at the psychology in this space, it's mostly focused on prejudice and extreme prejudice to account for sort of those hateful behaviors in a sense. So it's a difficult question. And a lot of the book talks about measurement. You know, how much hate is there? Is there more hate now than ever before? If so, what kind of arguments can be made to convince an audience that there is more hate now? To what extent might technology play a role, for example, which I'm sure we'll get onto? But the whole measurement phenomenon is so important. It's so important to dispel any kind of mis or disinformation surrounding the notion of hate crime and hate speech and prejudice more generally. And a lot of the book actually spends quite a bit of time on focusing on how we measure this phenomenon and how we measure it differently in different countries. So, for example, in the United States, there are figures collected by the FBI and local police forces that suggest that hate ebbs and flows over time. And we have similar statistics in the UK, and there's similar statistics in European countries and other parts of the world. But if you were to take those statistics as gospel in some ways, it would appear that the UK is the most hateful nation on the planet. We recorded last year, for example, around about 140,000 hate crimes compared to America's 8,500 hate crimes, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever because your population is much larger than ours. I know a lot is going on in the United States right now, but also we've got our own problems in the United Kingdom. But it makes no sense that those figures are so drastically different. And that can only come down to the way in which you measure it. They're not necessarily an accurate reflection of perpetration of hatred or the experience of hatred. It's very much how agencies and organizations collect the data and measure the concept of hatred and prejudice. So I get into all of that in the book because I think it's so important to understand when we see figures in the press and we see trends that go up and down over time, what we're actually looking at when we're looking at those numbers. And some people can get a bit put off by talking about statistics. I can understand that. I was a bit like that when I first started out understanding these phenomena. But it's so important to become a little bit literate in statistics, not in the sense of being able to conduct analyses, but in terms of having to read them. It's a critical faculty, I think, to understand the world around us and how people try to present certain versions of the world to us. You know, an understanding of how these things are compiled and an ability to question some of the statistics that are presented to us, I think, is so important, especially when we're comparing between countries and trying to understand, is the problem worse here or worse there?
So beyond the nomenclature or the definitions that constitute a hate crime, is there any universality, if you will, as far as the warning signs that would help us understand when someone is moving from a position of prejudice to dangerous behavior? And if there are such things, who is in the best position to spot that sort of those signs? Family, friends, schools, law enforcement?
It's a really good question. And I'll start by saying that in the academic study of prejudice and hate, we tend to focus on a certain kind of prejudice. And that's a prejudice focused on group membership primarily. We don't necessarily focus on forms of hate that are interpersonal. So, for example, a person might say, "Oh, I hate my ex-wife for doing me over in the divorce," you know, or I hate my father who abused me as a child. Or, you know, these are kinds of interpersonal expressions of extreme disgust and dislike, if you like. The term hate is, in the psychology of hatred and the criminology of hatred, is reserved for intergroup hatred. So the first sign is a person is expressing a very negative attitude towards a person or a group of people because of the perceived group they belong to. And it's usually that group membership which is a key indicator. If people are generalizing and saying, I hate that person because of the culture they belong to or the practices they embark on or whatever it might be, that's the first sign that they're engaging in that kind of intergroup derogation, if you like.
And integral to that process, I'm assuming, is stereotyping.
Absolutely. Stereotyping is one of the very first processes that occurs. And again, that's the brain being relatively lazy, us not going to seek out information that may break down that stereotype and undo that stereotype. And interesting studies out there show how you can undo those stereotypes quite easily in certain situations. And we can talk about that later. But ultimately, in terms of who's key to understanding if someone is tipping into that, it is those closest to you. It is family members, as you suggest. It is teachers and friends. You can start to see changing behaviors. And it's partly because it's those people closest to you that you feel more comfortable expressing those opinions towards. It's socially unacceptable, largely speaking, although I feel that's changing in the world right now, to express prejudice. It's very socially unacceptable to express prejudice. And that's because we've gone through what we call a civilizing process in relation to, say, women's rights, the civil rights movement, LGBTQ plus liberation movements, and so on and so forth. We went through those in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Different rights were then afforded to minority groups that were seen to be disadvantaged by society. And we began to understand as a society that there is privilege in being white, heterosexual, and male, essentially. And in many ways, it's not acceptable to express prejudice towards groups that have been systematically discriminated against. Now, that's changing slightly, I think, in the current climate in the US. It certainly is changing. It has changed in the UK, and it's certainly changed in certain parts of South America and in parts of Europe. I think the barometer is shifting slightly as more extreme right-wing views, I would argue, are gaining prominence. And I think now it's becoming more acceptable to express prejudice in public forums, whereas maybe 10 years ago that was more unthinkable. But for the majority of people, I still believe that expressing extreme prejudices are reserved for those closest to you. And that would potentially be partners, loved ones, and friends. And interestingly, this is maybe, I may be going off on a tangent here, but one of the key research findings we get from the data is that when people are slightly inebriated, if they've had a drink of alcohol, for example, they're more likely to express their true feelings because they're disinhibited. And this is partly because of how the brain works. Prejudices are kind of stored in the brain, but there's the smart part of our brain tells us not to express them in good company. But once the smart part of our brain is in some way hampered in its functioning, and alcohol can do that, as can drugs, then you're more likely to express these prejudices more freely. And this also then becomes very apparent when you look at the data to look at the co-occurrence of alcohol consumption and hate crimes. And over 50% of all hate crimes recorded tend to involve some form of drug or alcohol, because it frees up the mind to express prejudices in ways that you wouldn't normally do when you have your full faculties about you.
So if you are interacting with someone, a loved one, a partner, a student, what can you do individually to blunt that behavior?
I think the best thing to do is to engage in free speech. and that essentially is engage in dialogue and question the beliefs in a systematic and fair and caring way. Genuinely tease out the prejudices the person has. Don't shut them down immediately and just say that's wrong, because that only emboldens, I think, the prejudice. The key thing, as has always been in academia, and I think beyond in other forum, is like this forum, for example, is to engage in productive, open, peaceful debate, and just to quiz the assumptions that the person is making, and and do it in that very constructive way. It doesn't always work. I understand that. It doesn't always work. Some people are sometimes too far gone to be helped. They've become radicalized, potentially. And those who've become radicalized require more than just a casual intervention from a family member or a teacher, for example. But for the majority of people, and I must say that the majority of people who hold prejudices are not extremists. They are a very small minority. A good conversation with a person they trust and respect, and that's the important thing. If they trust and respect the person they're having the dialogue with, they're far more likely to stop questioning their own beliefs, which I think is really important. The other important thing I think is to engage in dialogue with the individuals or the group, the people from the groups that you perceive to potentially have a prejudice towards, to humanize them. Lots of research has suggested that contact with out-groups or groups that you have a prejudice towards or frustrations with, I'm frustrated with this group because of this and that. As soon as you start speaking to people from that group, and you do it in a constructive way, not a combative way, prejudices begin to break down. You begin to see that you have commonalities with the group that you thought you had nothing in common with whatsoever. You're struggling in similar ways in various aspects of your life, in terms of money and education and whatever it might be. And all of a sudden, you start to build bridges. And I think this contact with people from the groups that we think that we don't like or we hate in some cases is actually the most important thing we can do. And especially doing that with young people and kids, getting kids to mix with different groups as early as possible. As early as possible is key to not allowing those prejudices to form in the first place. And there's some really interesting psychology and neuroscience research that shows that kids who engage at a young age with different groups actually don't start to form those kinds of prejudices compared to kids that are isolated and only engage with people very like themselves.
What kind of events spark sudden surges in hate?
The book talks a lot about this, actually. There's a whole chapter dedicated to events and how they relate to hate. And we call them trigger events. Typically, what we've seen in the past, again, this is borne out in the data, divisive events like terror attacks, political votes, unsurprisingly, but also court cases and, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, big sporting events can result in the releasing of prejudice in the form of either verbal aggression or physical aggression. And the reason for that is that while we all have prejudices within us, we routinely suppress them. We routinely suppress prejudices. We all have different levels of prejudice. I don't think any of us is without prejudice because that's how the brain simply works. But most of us suppress our prejudices until something comes along, like a trigger event, that acts as a justification force that allows us to express the prejudice. So if it's a terror attack, for example, there's an increased sense of threat from an outgroup. Your culture, your country, your people have been attacked by an external force. There's a sense of threat that comes along with that. And threat creates a sense of frustration and fear within a lot of people. And if your prejudices are quite close to the surface, that sense, a heightened sense of threat, then acts as a justifying force to express that prejudice. Now, not everybody will express their prejudices because a lot of us still have our faculties about us and we will still suppress them and we'll rationalize them away. But ultimately, there are some in society whose prejudices are very close to the surface because they've been exposed to a lot of accelerants that I talk about in the book over their lifetimes. And when something like a terror attack or a court case or a political vote comes around, and if there's dog whistling going on, for example, by eminent politicians that have something to gain from dividing a population, like winning an election, then that will add to those justification forces. And we've seen this occur across the world. We've seen it occur in the United Kingdom when we had the Brexit vote and Nigel Farage and others were stirring up hatred in an attempt to create fear and anxiety and a sense of threat that resulted in the expression of prejudice on the streets. And I think a lot of the research that's come out, and some of our own research actually has shown that in the absence of the Brexit vote and the whole event that occurred around that vote, there would have been 1,000 fewer hate crimes in that period in time. And additional research has shown that in the US, during the first presidential race, where Trump was successful, that coincided also with a spike in hate crimes across the United States. And again, this is verified academic research from US scholars have shown this pattern. So events and the weaponization of events by nefarious public figures, be it politicians or otherwise, do coincide with increases in hate crime. And that's the interesting thing about hate crime versus other types of crime. Hate crime is very temporal. It's shaped by events and time, whereas other types of crimes tend to be less shaped by temporal forces. They tend to occur more randomly, based on opportunity, for example.
So how has the anonymity that online presence can afford an average person, how does that anonymity affect or manifest the spreading of hate? Is it easier these days by virtue of, hiding behind a handle online? Is it easier these days to hate?
A short answer, yes. I mean, I think anonymity and the sense of disinhibition that people feel when engaging online on social media and other types of online communication is the key factor in why we're seeing more hate and the more rapid spread of hate than ever before. That combined with various other factors like increasing polarization and echo chambers that seem to exist and algorithmic driven hate and so on and so forth. But anonymity is a key factor. It always has been. Even since the 1980s, when we first started to understand the effect of what we used to call computer-mediated communication, a bit of a mouthful, on human behavior, otherwise known as sort of internet interaction, if you like. We've known that it frees up individuals to be more expressive in both good and bad ways. People are quicker to fall in love online, for example, and express their love for something, but they're also quicker to express their disgust and hate for something online. And this is because there's this gap between yourself and the person you perceive you're speaking to. Often you perceive there to be hundreds, if not thousands of miles between you, which then all of a sudden increases the sense of distance. You're not using your real identity. You feel anonymous. It frees you up. There's also other psychological phenomena that increase the chances of you engaging in something negative or negative behaviors, sort of group-based dynamics, for example. When you're online, you feel like you're part of this amorphous, anonymous group of people who are doing the same thing as you. And that sort of group dynamic frees you up of responsibility in many ways. And again, there's lots of psychological research that I go through in the book from the 1950s and 60s that have discovered the phenomena of sort of disinhibition and de-individuation, where we can feel ourselves freed up by being part of this mass anonymous group of individuals all embarking on a similar kind of behavior. The internet is a wonderful thing. Don't get me wrong. I think the internet, when it first came about in the 1990s, was a phenomenal invention, and it stayed with us for a reason. It wasn't a bubble that disappeared. It's transformed economy, it's transformed relationships, it's transformed society for the better. This is just a very dark part of it that we're struggling with right now. And unfortunately, I think since the birth of social media, I think this is the key thing. It's social media in particular, I fear, and potentially now generative AI, which has come into the mix, that has actually created the most negative conditions for human interaction at a scale we've never seen before. I think when they first, those tech pioneers in the 90s, when they first imagined social media and the internet, they had a utopian kind of idea. It was that kind of Californian utopian ideal of like, let's bring people together, man. And I think that was a genuine hope that this technology could break down barriers between groups and countries and allow for a new era of peace, possibly. But unfortunately, what you need to generate that is positive contact. And unfortunately, what it's done is produced contact on a scale that we couldn't imagine, but that contact has been largely negative. And I think a big part of that is the profiteering from internet-based businesses and to the race to get users. And the way in which they've done that is to develop algorithms that keep people on platforms. And unfortunately, these algorithms learn from human behavior and the kinds of things that humans are most interested in and are fixated on are online threats. We look at our timelines far more when we're shocked and appalled by something. That and looking at really cute dog and cat videos, they're also really good at keeping us fixated. But the darker side of that is the darker stuff, the hateful stuff also keeps us fixated. And that's part of our human condition in a sense.
So apropos of generative AI, how big a manipulative role do bots and trolls play in the spread of hate online?
Significant. I must say significant. There's been research come out of our university that's shown, for example, around these trigger events that we talked about, there are also armies of bots, as you described them, at work pushing very certain narratives to stir up controversy, to push mis and disinformation, to fuel polarization and social discord. Some of this is evidenced as state manipulation. So, for example, there's evidence that Russia has in the past and continues to do so engage in information manipulation in an attempt to destabilize Western democracy. There's evidence that this has also occurred in China and other countries. And I dare say that our own governments have probably engaged in certain levels of this also. It's information warfare, effectively. So what they tend to do is piggyback on trigger events, stir up hatred. And what's really clever about these bots is that they don't just push one narrative, they push both sides of the narrative. So they try to create this kind of artificial sort of very tense negative dialogue between two very staunch positions. And they try to therefore create this what seems like an artificial sort of polarizing debate that then amplifies the organic side of that too. So they're very clever in manipulating the information ecosystem, and it's worked tremendously well in elections in particular, I think.
So if you could change one thing about this overt manipulation, this subtle manipulation that occurs on various social media platforms, if you could change one thing about how those platforms work, what to mitigate the spread of hate, what would it be?
It's a controversial suggestion, but I think the first thing we should try to encourage is the turning off of the engagement algorithms on platforms. Unfortunately, I don't think that's ever going to happen because engagement algorithms generate all the profit. And in a competitive market, certainly in the tech market, it's actually quite unimaginable that would ever happen. But that would ensure that the most bad content, the most salacious content, doesn't get promoted in timelines to keep people engaged. There are efforts by platforms, and don't get me wrong, I'm not all out against the platforms. They are trying to do good things. I have worked with some platforms in the past in trying to improve their policies in relation to hate speech. For example, I've worked for TikTok, I've advised Google, I used to advise Twitter before it became X. They have all at one point or another tried to improve their algorithms so they push less hateful content. But unfortunately, these engagement algorithms use sort of deep learning, it's called. So it's learning from human input. So essentially, the algorithms learn what human beings like to watch. And it's really quite hard then to undo those algorithms, because you don't actually see sort of what goes into creating that code. It becomes a point of trying to tweak the algorithm here and there to prevent it from promoting the worst kind of content. But it continuously learns from human input. And as long as humans are attracted to negative content, and we are attracted, it's a bit like when we're driving down the highway and there's a car crash and you don't want to look, but you do look. And it's where automatically, through our evolved physiology and biology, we're always looking out for threat, because that's how we're the dominant species on our planet. The reason we're so successful at dominating our planet is because we are amazing threat detecting machines. Our brains are brilliant at detecting threat. And our brains have evolved under those conditions for tens of thousands of years, longer than that. And this is what our brains are doing when we're looking at our timelines. We're still looking for threatening content that might threaten our worldview or threaten our well-being. And it's the algorithms that are picking up on this and feeding us more of it, because it knows it will keep watching. And the only way around that is to turn those algorithms off, but they won't do it. As soon as they do it, their share price will drop. And it's like committing an act of self-harm.
So if we are drawn intuitively, or inherently rather, to negative contact, and we are these threat awareness machines, and this inclination draws some, if not many, people into hate groups, how does that average person manage to leave those hate groups?
Well, for a person I think if we take a step back from that, I think it's useful to, first of all, categorize different types of haters, for want of a better term. So the ones you just described, members of hate groups, I would describe as mission haters. It's their life's mission to eradicate a group from society for one reason or another. They are radicalized. They are extremists. They're a minority. Thankfully, there are not that many of them out there, but they have a very loud voice. So it sounds as if there are a lot of them out there. They tend to be quite well organized. So it feels as if they're a strong presence. But they are actually a minority. I would say less than 1% of people who send hateful messages online would be categorized as that kind of mission hateful category. To change their minds requires sort of dedicated anti-radicalization work. That the professional work to change the minds of those people, because they've invested their whole life in it. They are full-time haters, if you like. They're full-time haters. Beneath that, we get both defensive and retaliatory haters. Now, these are the kinds of haters that are activated by trigger events in particular. They aren't full-time haters. They are usually law-abiding citizens. They don't act upon their prejudices every single day. They only tend to act when their territory is invaded and they feel threatened, potentially, or an event occurs and they feel that their culture is somehow threatened, or the safety of their country is somehow threatened, or their worldview is somehow threatened. So they were what we call retaliatory and defensive haters. They are activated by these kinds of events. Then we get the thrill-seeking haters. Now, these individuals are less likely to have hardened prejudices. They probably don't hate the groups that they're targeting in the real sense of what we've been describing as extreme prejudice, but they're doing it for the thrill of it. Now, this is what we see a lot on social media, is that a lot of the people that jump on the bandwagon and start spreading hateful rhetoric around a certain subject towards a certain group, they aren't necessarily doing it all the time, and they're doing it because they think it's fun to be part of the group. They're getting a thrill out of it. And thrill-seeking haters are actually the ones that we can target most effectively with interventions. They're the ones who are more likely to be responsive to sort of education, if you like, and that kind of counter-speech intervention that we sometimes see on social media. And that's a whole part of the book dedicated to understanding what the average citizen can do when they encounter hateful speech on social media, or if they encounter it on the streets. And that's to engage in that kind of counter-narrative work, if you feel safe to do so. Now, increasingly in this polarized world, I think people feel increasingly less safe. about engaging in dialogue with people who express these kinds of opinions. But if this person expressing the hate we feel is a thrill-seeking hater, i.e., they don't have the hardened prejudices that the mission hater has, the knowledge that they are more likely to be persuaded to come around to a more sensible point of view, I think is encouraging. So I think engaging in that counter-narrative with the ones that are most susceptible to intervention is a key point.
What has been the most surprising or counterintuitive finding from your 25 years of research into prejudice and hate?
I think that it isn't hardwired, that hate is learned. I think when I was attacked, I was looking for this kind of answer to the question that would separate my attackers from me in this very kind of black and white way. The fact that, there are people that are born with this kind of psychology that inclines them to hate. And that's not necessarily the case. Hate is learned over time. And there are certain kinds of life events that occur to individuals that increase the propensity for them to engage in hateful behavior. And I think that was not only the most surprising discovery very early on in my career, but also one of the most rewarding and most hopeful discoveries, was that this stuff is learned. And if it's learned, it can be unlearned. But the problem is, and there are lots of lab experiments that show that, for example, if you prime a person with a message from an out group, say a black doctor says something about a particular topic, because the doctor was black and that black person was a doctor, the fact that message has come through, it can break down the stereotype, the typical potential stereotype of blackness in ways that reduce prejudice overall. So there's interesting studies that show presenting positive stereotypes of minority groups, if you like, have a very powerful effect on prejudice thinking. However, you take that person out of the lab and put them back into society, where the stereotypes still exist, the negative stereotypes still exist, then they go back to their old way of thinking. So we know how the brain works and how we can, if you like, change behaviors via psychological processes. But we can't have those, if you like, remain constant in society at large. And so that takes a much more coordinated effort, the kinds of efforts that governments have to undertake, if you like. So it becomes a social policy question and not a scientific question. How do you get the understandings from psychology labs out into society to ensure that these prejudices and negative stereotypes can melt away? And that's the tricky thing, and that's why we're still in this space we are right now, I think, is because while we know psychologically what works in the lab, it's really hard to get that out of the lab into society at large.
How much does generational interaction perpetuate the phenomena of hate? In other words, how would I be inaccurate in saying that, people can be largely influenced by their parents and their grandparents, and that the perceptions that one's parent or grandparent has the potential to be handed down generationally, one new generation to the next?
Yes. Yeah, I think hugely. We do inherit a lot from our parents and grandparents, genetically, clearly, but also in terms of personality traits. About 50% of personality traits tend to be handed down from parents to kids. But as I said earlier, personality traits don't necessarily map on then to sort of hateful thinking or behaviors. That's still learned. But if those parents are passing down hateful narratives to their kids, then of course they will start to ingrain. However, research suggests once that child is taken out of the family context and maybe they go to university, then all that can be undone quite quickly, actually. And I think when kids go through teenage years, it's quite a rebellious stage. And very often the parents' attitudes and the kids' attitudes are at odds. And research suggests that over time, and I think most listeners would have experienced this, over time, new generations are more tolerant than previous generations, and the research shows that. But at the same time, as we get older, we do become more conservative with a small c in terms of our outlook in life. So that kind of combats that kind of shift. But yeah, I think it's absolutely socialization and parental socialization in particular, and association with peers is a key part of understanding why prejudices can become ingrained.
So in the context of your personal experience, in the context of so many years of research, I would imagine that it would be very easy to become depressed about all of this. And yet much of your book strikes a very optimistic tone. What makes you hopeful that there is that we have the ability as a species to reduce hate in the world?
I have faith in humanity, which sounds glib potentially, but I think that on the whole, human beings are good. I think there are pockets of evil. Obviously, history will show that. We've overcome a lot of that, I think. In some cases, we haven't, and there's been dire consequences to it. But on the whole, I have faith in humanity, and I think inherently we're good people. I think that human beings, by default, want to be nice to each other. I think that's what we've seen in the research as well. That it's much easier. It takes much less cognitive effort to be nice than it does to be mean or hateful. It takes a lot to be hateful, and it's in some ways more against our nature to be hateful than to be cooperative and nice. And there's a lot of psychological research that suggests that even when you've got two opposing groups, when they've got a common goal to overcome because they're both facing the same adversity, very quickly those differences can melt away and commonalities are found between people. So I think hate and prejudice is actually quite a fragile thing for most people. It's quite a fragile thing for most people, and it can be broken down with the right kinds of interactions that the science suggests. So because I've seen it in the lab, because I've seen it in the data, I'm always quite surprised at how good people can be in the face of all the stuff that we're seeing around us. So I do have that kind of faith in humanity.
The interaction that you talk about is obviously one-on-one. When you recognize that the individual or the group of individuals that you have demonized or deemed to be subhuman are in fact not that dissimilar from you, I would imagine is when the tide changes.
Yeah, it's that interpersonal contact, and that contact is prolonged, and it's task orientated sometimes as well. And there's a common goal to be achieved, and it's been sanctioned by authority figures. This is sort of Gordon Allport's, one of the more famous psychologists in this area, that wrote The Nature of Prejudice in the 1950s, purported, and it's been tested in over 500 studies, on over 250,000 people in over 38 countries. And it's one of the most consistent findings that we have in the psychology of prejudice and hate. And is that positive contact between people under the right conditions, it has to be under the right sets of conditions, can foster liking and respect and cooperation that then sees the melting away of the worst prejudices and hatred.
Matt, thank you so much for your research, for your insights. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Dave, for a fascinating, certainly timely, and important conversation. And a huge thanks to our audience joining. We are thinking of this subject as a two-part presentation, with this being part one on hate and part two, the companion piece on altruism and why we love. And finally, before we go, we'd like to thank the following friends and neighbors for their generous support of the St. Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. If you'd like to add your name to the list, please go to shforum.org and donate to these dialogues. If you'd like to read more on today's subject, you can find a copy of Dr. Williams' book, The Science of Hate, at bookstores everywhere or on Amazon. Thank you again, Dave and Matthew, and thanks to our audience for being with us.